NASA is 64 years old and has sometimes acted like it. Back in 2010, when Lori Garver became the number 2 at the space agency, commercial space was just a glimmer on the horizon. This week, we talked to Lori about her new book and her time at NASA and how she helped to reinvent the world's favorite space agency for a new space age.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode 24, recorded July 22nd, 2022 for August 12th, 2022, Reinventing NASA. Welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Reinventing NASA edition. We have a real treat in store today. We're going to be talking to Lori, who has just published her new book called Escaping Gravity, which has been billed as a tell-all about her experiences moving our favorite space agency into the 21st century, which was not an easy task. Hello, Lori. How are you?
Hello, Rod. I am great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, and I'm really excited about your book. Congratulations. It's a banner achievement. And we're joined, of course, by Jeff Notkin, our guest co-host, a fellow science writer, star of TV's Meteorite Man, and a governor of the National Space Society and former president. Say hello, Jeff.
Greetings, Captain Pyle. Nice spaceship you have here. I am so thrilled that Lori is on the show for this episode. This is going to be a good one.
Now, some of you may not know, probably don't know, Lori was also a past executive director of the National Space Society, and Geoffrey, as I mentioned, was our past president, and I published their magazine, so it's a bit of an old home week here today. Regardless of that, I'm going to do a space joke because I'm never one to buck tradition. So it's 2034. Scientists have decided to send a cat to the asteroid belt ahead of humans. They loaded the spacecraft with balls of yarn and catnip, and the cat went bonkers along the way, bumping into some control rods and eventually crash landing on Mars. He wandered freely until one day there was a whining mechanical noise, but the cat was so looped on catnip, he didn't react until a shadow loomed large overhead and squashed him into the sand. It can be said that truly on that day, curiosity killed the cat.
Oh, this is
Jeff,
amazing. I also have space pet jokes.
Oh, good.
Go on. Do you have a...
Hit me.
All right, I'm going to... Okay. What is the astronaut's favorite breed of dog? Skylab, of course. And what did the astronaut name? And what did the astronaut name her Skylab? Mars Rover.
Oh, you gave him a
I got 2 drum rolls.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to get right to Lori. You have another one?
I do. This is not a space pet joke. Okay. Why did the young Shakespearean actor who had grown up in Stratford-upon-Avon decline an invitation to perform in space? Because such a performance would have entailed first stage separation.
Ooh. Did you write that one?
Yes, I did. I write my own material in case the Tonight Show is listening. Thank you.
I'm very impressive. All right. Let's get some headlines done here. The Falcon is heavy. NASA has announced its choice of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy to launch the Nancy Roman Space Telescope, formerly known as WFIRST. The Falcon Heavy is an outgrowth of Elon Musk's original Falcon 9 rocket, the workhorse of SpaceX, a bit of a side gig in effect, that turned out to be much more of an engineering challenge than he'd assumed. But the Heavy launcher has performed well since its inaugural flight in February 2018, with a total of 3 launches to date and a number more contracted. It's been certified for national security launches and was originally intended for human spaceflight, but Musk superseded that plan with his Starship. In any case, the Falcon Heavy has been a remarkable engineering success, with all 3 of its boosters returning for reuse. Go Elon. Jeff, you got a comment?
I'd like to recognize that the telescope was named after Nancy Grace Roman, who passed away in 2018. She was a very impressive woman. She was first woman executive at NASA and is sometimes known as the mother of Hubble, as she's credited as being the creator of NASA's astronomy program. She had a marvelous career, including working at the Naval Research Laboratory, radio astronomy, stellar observations, worked at Goddard Flight Center, traveled all over the country lecturing in astronomy, and she had an asteroid named after 2516, Nancy Grace Roman.
Wow. Okay, that's cool. Next and last, and this is also from space.com, as was our previous headline. Rogozin is out. The colorful chief of the Russian Space Agency, Dmitry Rogozin, has been deposed or perhaps promoted. He was dismissed the same day that Russia signed a new agreement with NASA for launching astronauts to the International Space Station on Soyuz rockets. Speculation is that Rogozin will either take a slot in Vladimir Putin's inner circle or will perhaps become an administrator of newly conquered territories in Ukraine, boo, or maybe he'll just be airbrushed out of some photographs. We'll see. Putin, however, was reportedly pleased with Rogozin's support for the Russian aggression in Ukraine and may have been impressed by a recent shenanigan when cosmonauts aboard the ISS displayed flags of the parts of Ukraine under Russian control. Double boo. His replacement is Yuri Borisov, who served as Russia's deputy prime minister since 2018 and previously served as deputy minister of defense. And we'll see how colorful he is.
I agree with double boo on that. And let's be clear that Rogozin was a politician and previously deputy prime minister of Russia. So not exactly a spaceflight professional. And he famously tweeted in 2014, after analyzing sanctions against our space industry, I suggest to the USA to bring their astronauts to the International Space Station using a trampoline. So I bet he doesn't have an asteroid named after him.
Yeah, and then he also, I believe, was the guy who suggested that it was our astronauts that went crazy and drilled holes in their spacecraft, which Lori might have something to say about. What do you think?
I have no love for, is this my opening? Rogozin at all. And I seriously doubt that astronauts drilled holes in the space station.
Okay, good. All right. So we're going to be back to talk to Lori Garver after this short break, so stand by. So, Lori, you had a remarkable career with NASA. You've had a remarkable career overall. I'd love to hear about your path to the next to the top job at the agency and what it was like to do that as a woman.
Well, thank you, Rod. I've really just been very, very lucky, I will readily admit, in my career. As I typically advise to anyone who's interested in career advice, work hard, show up, and then work even harder. In my case, this was helped by a master's degree while I was working at the National Space Society. I did that at night while working full time. It was helped by getting to know the NASA administrator at the time, Dan Golden, who hired me in the 1990s. And while working for the aerospace industry, continuing to volunteer for presidential candidates as their space policy advisor. I was a space policy advisor for candidate Dukakis, candidate Kerry, candidate Clinton, and candidate Obama, and then later candidate Biden. So each of those experiences helped build on the next. I learned much of my ideology from the National Space Society, where I spent 13 years. And as I say, while NSS shaped my ideology, Dan Golden forged it into steel. When I came back in 2008 to lead the NASA transition team for President-elect Obama, I had already been in the business, shall we say, for 25 years and was ready to build upon that knowledge to have the very best space agency policy and programs that we could have moving forward. It wasn't easy, as you said. I'm sure we'll get into some of those reasons. One of those reasons was certainly as a woman, but there were others.
Okay. Geoffrey, you were past president of the National Space Society. You want to compare notes for a moment?
Yes, I'm very interested in this, in your journey. Thank you, Rod. Lori, so many years as an officer in, we might say, a civilian grassroots organization. That's one thing. To then transfer into one of the highest positions in spaceflight in this country, it's an enormous change. How did you find the balance in your life, or the pressures on your life, having gone from more of a volunteer grassroots organization to a very prominent government agency?
Well, I was early in my career at the Space Society, but I did stay, as I said, for 13 years. And you're right, volunteer led. I was always reporting to volunteers. The first 3 years I reported to the executive director, who at that time was Glenn Wilson. I really think that working for the Space Society, the volunteers who were elected, as well as the members, was great training to work in the government, because you have this really broad constituency that you need to carry their views forward and toward their mission. And at NASA, those very broad views were the taxpayers. They were paying my salary. And I always took that very seriously. I worked a lot of hours at the National Space Society, so I'm not even sure when I was at NASA that was too much of a change in my work habits. I've always been able to integrate, I think, my family life. My husband works at Lockheed Martin. He worked at AIAA. He worked at NSS. And so we are a space family. Our two children, while not in space professionally, in the space field professionally, grew up going to launches, taking calls from Buzz Aldrin, who was telling them, tell your mom Buzz Lightyear's on the phone. It wasn't a bad gig for them. They are 30 and 27 now, and we're getting the chance to talk about it a lot with the book. And they, of course, support their mom and their parents' mission of a spacefaring civilization with a twist. It allowed me, I think, to be able to have an intense career as a female and as a mother, where a lot of times you feel like you're giving something up when you're trying to do that. But I think NSS was great training for NASA.
Excellent. Well, and I think your family would be ideal casting for the next remake of Lost in Space.
Oh, yes, we watched that.
Family.
Yeah. We have a dog, and he'd like to be in it too.
Excellent.
As the robot.
So the real question is who's going to play Dr. Smith, but we'll let that one sit for now. So your book is called Escaping Gravity, which I assume is moving on the bestseller list as we speak, should be. And it really details your time with the agency. And I'll quote the publisher's description here. How Lori Garver's battle against the greed and corruption of the U.S. space program revolutionized NASA and ushered in a new space age. So what was your primary motivation in writing this book?
Well, as you know, thankfully, that is the publisher's description. Controversy sells. Right. It wasn't written to be controversial or really a tell-all in the sense of there are no personal attacks in it. But I knew when I left NASA in 2013 that I had insight into an important part of what now is NASA space history, and that it needed to be told. There always has been broad misconception about how NASA makes decisions, how NASA should be incorporated into the broader government. And I believe that because my background didn't typify the types of people who had come before me in these jobs, that I had a perspective that should be shared. And that was why I did it. I feel like NASA, we were able to accomplish something very difficult. We were able to stand up against the status quo and have human spaceflight become more efficient. And that is something that can be a blueprint for other government programs. So that was an additional reason for writing the book.
And congratulations on the publication of it, Lori. I'm sure you know, Rod wrote a wonderful review for National Space Society, and I read a little quote from it. He says, "Thus began her sometimes tumultuous and always transformative career as the number 2 boss at NASA." So we're all three writers here on the show today. I've written, Rod's an eminent science writer, as you know, author of many fine books. And I've written about half science-related nonfiction and about half memoir. So you've written a memoir about what could be seen as quite a controversial period in American spaceflight history. And I wonder if you ever felt you had difficulty balancing being truthful and accurate with also perhaps not wanting to be critical of people you may have admired and worked with? Was it ever a struggle for you?
Yes. In fact, when I'm asked what was the most challenging about writing, it was that. I enjoyed the writing process. I enjoyed the research process, the editing process. My family joked every time I'd say, I think this is my favorite part. But the least favorite part was working through how to be honest and truthful enough that people could understand where the challenges were. You know, you can't be a blueprint for change if you aren't open about where the conflict was. But doing that in a way that wasn't going to come off as personal attacks. These are people who, for the most part, you know, I have had positive working relationships with. As I say in the author's note, none of these are bad people just because we had these policy disagreements, and they all, to a person, have made wonderful contributions to society and even the space program beyond these issues that I outline in the book. That said, it was a lot harder to live through it than it was to write about it. So when people have a bit of a concern, like, well, why are you bringing all this up? It's like, well, why did they do it? That should be more fundamental to me.
So you kind of, when you got to NASA, and I don't have my timeline nailed down here as well as I should, but my impression is you kind of came out swinging with your sights pretty early on set on ending the shuttle program and also canceling Constellation, which was, as I gather, more controversial. So I'd like to hear about that and when and how commercial space entered that conversation, because that was a big deal.
Yes, well, we can't fall into the trap of thinking I canceled the space shuttle program. That had been done. We had the president in 2004, President Bush, make that announcement as a reaction to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. The previous head of NASA, Mike Griffin, had made all those decisions. When I came in on the transition team in the fall of 2008, I asked immediately Bill Gerstenmaier, who was running the program, if it could be extended. And he said, no, the third tier suppliers have gone away. This was not my call. I believe there's a lot of reasons that people like to blame me for it. I actually think it was the right decision. I think that many, many men more senior to me made that decision. And I am still often blamed for it by leaders, members of Congress, et cetera. But when I came in, we asked for as many shuttle flights as we could extend, and Gerstenmaier told me that was 2. We had 2 external tanks, one that had been damaged in Hurricane Katrina, so it wasn't a sure thing. We cobbled together enough money to fly those. That's something the previous administration was not going to do. We also extended the space station. Constellation was the program that was of record, as we like to say. It was ongoing, as in it was receiving $4 billion plus a year of funding. In its first 5 years, it had slipped another 5 years. Or in its first 4 years, it slipped 5. That was the program that was supposed to replace the shuttle with transportation of astronauts to the space station and to return to the moon. We did our best to tee up. A transition team is not making decisions. They are teeing up options and recommendations to the incoming administration. And we were unable even to get full information on Constellation. A lot of this I outline in the book. The reasons were, I think people were trying to protect information they knew would not be good for them. And so we put in the commission known as the Augustine Commission, another Augustine Commission, this one, a human spaceflight review in 2009. 9 experts in aerospace from a range of traditional institutions, astronauts, New Space, have put together their report and made it clear that Constellation was not sustainable. I'll just give the one data point that the launch vehicle, Ares 1 with Orion, wasn't even going to be able to have its first launch on the books. This is in 2009, until 2017. But the space station was going to be deorbited in 2016, and that was its destination. And so when I asked about that, the people at NASA just, really didn't like these questions. And their plan, if you could call it a plan, was basically to just keep asking for more money. It would become clear that they had to have more money or we wouldn't have any space flight, a space station, or an ability to launch for many years. So yeah, I said the other day on another podcast, they're saying, can you be blamed for canceling Constellation? I said, I wish it wasn't canceled. But right. Yes, we hope to cancel it. We believed it should be canceled, but those contracts were extended after the big battle on the Hill.
Well said, Lori. I'm very interested. I'd like to step back a moment if we can. You said that you found the process of writing easy. And I loved your quote that it was easier to live through these events than write about them. Would you
the
share?
Opposite. It was easier to write about it than live through them.
I'm so sorry. I got that backwards in my head. I did understand what you said. Said though. I'm really interested in your process as a writer. There's a lot to tell here over a long period of time. Are you an author who likes to write things in sequence? Do you start at the beginning and work through to the end, or did you write your favorite parts first and then make them fit into a jigsaw puzzle?
A bit of both. I can't really even call myself a writer like you two. I mean, this is a single book. I have joked that if I write another one, it would be fiction, because then I really could tell it all without having to research it and be quoting the dates that things happened. But my process started with an outline. I'm sure most do, but that does not look anything like what the ultimate book ended up doing. So I jumped around a bit, and I think maybe like a lot of first-time writers, I wrote too much. I had around 120,000 words, and this ended up being 93,000 words due to some great editing from outsiders. And even when I began, wasn't clear to me it was a memoir. When I began, it was more a book about this, about space policy. But it became very clear over time, and I was doing this initially with a colleague, Michael Sheets, who we had weekly phone calls to sort of shape out the narrative. And that evolved over that first year, and it became clear it was my story to tell, and therefore going to be in the first person, and therefore a memoir.
Very good.
So I'd love to know what your definition of the space industrial complex is, as you put it, and how bold did you feel at the time when you came in that it was to support new space entrepreneurs like Elon Musk when that part of the industry was so new?
Sure. The military industrial complex is a common description of the large aerospace companies and the arms of government that work with them, including the Hill and the administration and different agencies. The space industrial complex to me are the parts of that do space. And for me, that I didn't even call it aerospace because it's more NASA. And I shied away from using what has been becoming this nomenclature of new space and old space. I mean, no one wants to be called old space. And by the way, we're not going to be new forever. So the space industrial complex was a way to just use words to describe something that hopefully people could identify generally what it was. As for my views on commercial space, I actually did not think what we were proposing was overly controversial. It's so logical. And again, growing up at the National Space Society, where your goal is to create a spacefaring civilization, it's common knowledge that's not going to be done by the government. In fact, the space shuttle's very goal was to reduce the cost of space transportation and open up space for more than just the government. It did not do that. Dan Golden in the 1990s put forward the program called the X-33. It was a partnership with industry. The follow-on vehicle was not going to be owned and operated by the government. These were very logical ways to proceed. Even the space shuttle operators looked to privatize the vehicle, but because it hadn't been designed for sustainability, certainly on cost, they weren't able to make their business case close. Space transportation is something we have been doing for more than 60 years for people as well as for stuff. And it was a natural follow-on to the commercial cargo program that was already in place when I came back as the transition team lead. In fact, that partnership agreement had an option for bidders to offer a crew transportation element. My first action, yes, coming right out of the blocks, was we had this stimulus bill, the American Recovery Act, that was supported by both the outgoing President Bush and the incoming President Obama. We in the transition teams were asked to put forward shuttle-ready projects that could employ people and help the economy, and I put forward what was called COTS D, which was the crew element of COTS. That wasn't accepted by the administration, but they did propose $150 million. The bid from SpaceX was just over $300 million. And that was whittled down over time, but it did get our foot in the door to establish a commercial crew program office. And that became critical because the fight did get bloody when we put forward our budget and had proposed canceling the Constellation program. I truly believe that commercial crew would not have been nearly as controversial if we had somehow been able to just do it on the side along with Constellation. Of course, that didn't make sense. It would have been competitive with Ares 1 and Orion, but since we've got a program that doesn't make a ton of sense now, I guess that's not really a prerequisite.
So you arrived in NASA with some bold, fresh, some might say controversial ideas. How much of an old boys network did you walk into when you arrived with an emphasis on the boys? What was that experience like?
Well, the experience was very negative. It did happen to be all men, I think, taking me on within NASA, the administrator, the associate administrators, the heads of human space flight, the head of safety, the head of engineering. It is really hard to separate how much of that was because I was female and how much of it had to do with me being second in command at NASA, not first. I think the administrator could have provided the cover to make this a more seamless transition. He chose not to do that, as I outline in the book. But even when I was leading the transition team, I wasn't taken seriously. There were petitions, as I say in the book, by some of these people to get rid of me. And I think there were people concerned that what I was proposing would undermine their way of doing business. And this is why I quote often in speeches, and I do in the book, Moneyball, because it is similar to what Billy Beane went through and what anyone goes through who's trying to go up against an entrenched workforce, whether that is government or private sector. You are threatening the people whose livelihoods, are based on a certain way of doing things. And I understand that is hurtful. And I didn't have the tools, again, being number two, being a woman without an engineering background, but it was so clearly necessary to have the space program that this nation deserves. And yet the people fighting on the other side were able to make the argument that they had the best interest of the space program in mind. And in fact, what I was trying to do would ruin the space program. That was perhaps the hardest because I knew the opposite was true.
Very good. We have more questions, and we'll be back with more of Lori Garver after this short break. So, Lori, you came in at a critical time for NASA and sort of began, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, reinventing the agency, or at least how they do business and how they look at human spaceflight in particular. And at the same time, this thing called SLS sort of continued moving onward, coming out of Constellation, ostensibly using legacy shuttle hardware. Can you kind of explain how that worked and your feelings about it over the years?
Sure. Because of our attempt to cancel Constellation, the industry, who already had contracts to carry out that program, were really banded together to make sure that those contracts weren't canceled. And they were in lockstep with the NASA leadership team, other than myself, and a couple of others. And they were also in lockstep with the key people on the Hill who had Constellation jobs in their districts. What they decided to do brilliantly was to, let go of the first rocket in their plan of Constellation, the Ares 1, but focus on the heavy lift rocket, which they weren't going to even have money to start for 5 years. But they forwarded that money and wrote legislation that required NASA to build a rocket that would be able to launch 70 metric tons initially, moving on to above, 120 metric tons, do it by the end of 2016, do it with, initially around $8 billion, that increased to maybe 11. But this was all a very well orchestrated plan centering on the aerospace industry contracts that existed already so that they wouldn't have to compete those. And so that they changed the architecture, but it was the same. In fact, they got even more money to continue and to accelerate a heavy lift launcher. It was clear to me when this legislation was drafted that we should not be agreeing to this, but the administration, by now, it was about 6 months in after we put forward our budget request, wasn't willing to fight the people who had been doing this. We were, as a nation, dealing with a lot of things like trying to pass healthcare reform. We were right when we were going to lose our Democratic supermajority because Senator Kennedy had died. You don't think when you're a space advocate of how many things play with whether or not the administration is going to put forward political capital to advance a really positive agenda for NASA. And I think the Obama administration, as I say in the book, put forward a very visionary, effective program for NASA, and they did so at some political cost. But when it came right down to it, because their NASA administrator wasn't really able to articulate why that vision was beneficial, we folded. We ended up saying yes to SLS in exchange for the Hills agreement to fund commercial crew, technology, and earth sciences, and the Webb telescope, although everybody wanted to fund the Webb telescope, which wasn't easy given its cost growth. So we sometimes hear SLS called the Senate Launch System. I do not share in calling it that because the call was coming from inside the House. NASA leaders were working with congressional staff and industry to extend contracts and get SLS. And we now, 12 years later, have been funding it at a couple $2 billion a year. We will have a test flight here certainly in the next month or two, and then $4 billion a launch for the next couple of launches, assuming it goes perfectly. If it doesn't go perfectly, as far as I can tell, we have nowhere to turn because you can't really put astronauts on a vehicle after one test that didn't go perfectly. So it's a bad plan. It's a very bad plan. And I feel terrible that I was part of the administration that ended up signing off on it.
So even though Congress agreed to this deal, they, for a number of years, as I understand it, continually underfunded commercial space. How did that come to be?
Yes, that was the other reason I hated the deal. There was absolutely no way to assure that the Congress would fulfill their commitment on commercial crew. In fact, we didn't even talk about the numbers. We had put forward $500 million budget requests for the first year of commercial crew. I think $300 million in technology, and these budgets over the 5-year run out, commercial crew was going to be a total of $6 billion. And we felt that within those 5 years, for that amount of money, we could get 2 competitors. We got pushback at every turn. They cut technology even more than they cut commercial crew. But commercial crew was cut, I think, about 40% over those first couple of years, and we didn't get near $6 billion in the first 5 years. Of course, it took longer. Congress also nearly forced us to select only one provider a couple years in, which was also not our agreed upon plan. The people within NASA even tried to force us going to a fixed costs instead of a partnership, to a FAR-based contract much earlier than we knew was appropriate. So there were fights at every turn, even after we made the deal. And there were also just misinformation out there. The Congress would say, when we requested over $3 billion each year for a combination of SLS and Orion, that we were undercutting our part of the deal when we had agreed to $3 billion a year. They would take money from commercial crew, put it into SLS and Orion that were already getting multiples of the amount of money. I don't like comparisons because SLS and Orion were for deep space, have different capabilities and constraints. But even so, if you compare what they've gotten to SpaceX to do astronaut transportation to and from the space station, it's about 10 times the amount that SpaceX received.
Without quite 10 times the results. Geoffrey.
Right.
Lori, you've had a fascinating career in the NSS and NASA, but I want to be sure our listeners know that there's a lot more to your life than those areas. In 2016, you founded the Brooke Owens Fellowship, and I'm going to read a little bit from the mission statement on the website that says, created to honor the legacy of a beloved space industry pioneer and accomplished pilot, Dawn Brooke Owens. The fellowship is designed to serve both as an inspiration and as a career boost to capable young women and other gender minorities. Would you like to talk a little bit about your work with the fellowship and this idea of getting paid internships in space-related industries?
Wonderful, of course. I try not to get emotional because just thinking about Brooke and she had cancer. She was diagnosed when she was 30 and died at 36. She was a mentee of mine and at the Office of Management and Budget in the last few years of her life. And when she died, I really felt, while we had talked a lot about, she and I, having more women and minorities in the aerospace world, we were both wired, as I say in the book, to do more than talk. So we started a fellowship, which at the time I thought maybe we'd get 12 interns a year, try and recruit host organizations who would pay for these summer internships, recruit mentors from the senior ranks in the space community, and bring them together every year for a summit. This is now our sixth class of the program, and we just had the summit last week. We expanded the fellowship to include a sister fellowship, if you will, called the Patty Gray Smith Fellowship, and those are for collegiate Black students. We have 40 Patty Gray Smith Fellows this year. There are at least 3 additional fellowships where now over 200 collegiate early career people are coming through our system, working at the companies that really are taking advantage of the new ideas that young people have, and we are getting an infusion of diversity and diversity of thought from these fellowships. It's a joy of my life. I have, I could not have imagined now that we would already be so far along in the program.
Well, it's wonderful, and for our listeners, I'll just say there's a big smile on your face when you're talking about the fellowship. And what's the success rate like for you? How do you have an idea of how many of your participants doing the internships then decide to really pursue a career in related fields?
We are all about the data. No surprise, we're space people, and it is not our intent that everyone go into aerospace. It is our intent that, these people are given the information about aerospace so that they can make a decision. But certainly over 80% of them do choose our field. Again, this is year 6. And in addition to the fellows who go through the program, one of the really exciting elements is that we now have this year over 1,000 applications for these 50 fellowships. And these companies ask us to forward the resumes and applications of well beyond who it is that we're able to have in the fellowship directly. So I think the impact has been very large, and you can no longer get away with saying that these aren't people who are interested in our field.
That's wonderful. Your enthusiasm is marvelous, and those statistics are really impressive. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, Lori, during your time at NASA, you went through pushback most of us can scarcely imagine, and not just from NASA officials, but from contractors, from people in Congress, even former astronauts, most of which I view as patently unfair, but that's just me. But what were some of the personal costs along the way, and is there any remainder of that now for you?
Sure. I mean, some of it was absolutely fair. I mean, you sign up to these jobs not to be popular, and anyone in a decision-making capacity who's trying to make change is going to be criticized. So I have gotten, thick skin over the years. Some of, as we've talked about, the gender-based attacks were, of course, uncalled for. And personally, I did have a little bit of physical threat that during the height of the debate was, of course, very unwelcome and difficult with a family and so forth. But for the most part, I think I say in the book, it left deep scars. It's impossible to know what that really manifests into. I think for the most part, I am no longer afraid of speaking my mind because sort of, I don't know, bring it. I don't know what else people could have done to me. I was sent dog in the mail. I mean, come on. Yeah. It's just, not to mention the fake anthrax that I talk about in the book. But the difficulty for just having views that are different should not be the way, certainly a space community that is focused on innovation and the future, that shouldn't be the way we carry out our programs. So I know a lot of people are more passive aggressive and have attacked me quietly or kept me from jobs, kept me from board positions. I see so many people getting these positions who were opposed to commercial space, and now they're on these commercial space boards. Of course, it's frustrating, but it is also something you just have to accept and move forward. We have a wonderfully successful program today, and that was the goal.
Now that you've done the work on the first book, Lori, maybe it's a bit early to ask this, but related to my previous question, because there have been so many fascinating episodes in your life, do you think you have a second book in you or more other adventures from the life of Lori Garver?
Well, as I said, I enjoyed the process, so I wouldn't rule it out, but I have not centered on a topic yet. My joke that it might be fiction is potentially real, although again, it's sort of bizarre. I gave a couple of interesting parts of my life short shrift in the book, one of them being Astro Mom, when I was, training in Russia to go to space, and Lance Bass from NSYNC showed up. But I think it'll be a while before I decide there's something else to write about. My focus today is on trying to help get our government to be more effective, and there's certainly a lot of work ahead there.
Very good.
So I think, Lori, we first met in the 1990s, as I recall. I knew about you prior to that, being an NSS member from, 84 on, when it was still NSI, I think. And I was always impressed with the sense of vision that I felt you had. And I have seen you for a long time as a new space visionary. So I just would ask you to look into your magic 8 ball and see what you think we're going to be looking at in the next 10 to 20 years of human spaceflight.
Oh, well, that's very nice. Thank you. I really feel like the vision that I have was just learned and adopted from others, many from the National Space Society. For the future, what I see is being able to develop space in a way that we can go and stay. But I'm pretty focused today on how we utilize the unique vantage of the atmosphere and beyond to benefit humanity. And at least for the taxpayer-funded part of the program, that is a requirement. And we are experiencing a climate crisis, and about 80% of what we know of climate change comes from data we've gathered in space, NASA scientists modeling data. We have, I think, the ability to do even more from space to help mitigate the climate disaster. Some of this is in more observation. Some of it is likely in more innovative concepts like solar power satellites. Some of it is in getting manufacturing off the planet and ultimately having humanity be able to live outside of the Earth. I think that is going to be a multi-generational task, and therefore I do put priority on the next few generations' survival here, and survival in a way that we are still capable of doing great things like expanding into space. So those are, I know, not the high and mighty, we're going to have lunar bases and Mars colonies in our lifetime, but I don't think we are. I perhaps will be wrong. I've bet on SpaceX and won, and I would never bet against them. But I think some of the goals they have, depending on if Starship becomes operational anytime soon, what will be the long-term market for that? What will we be doing with it a couple times a day or a week, however long, whatever their promotion is? I tend to think that point-to-point transportation through suborbital space on Earth is a market that I think we'll see in the future before we see sort of regular flights to Mars, but I could be wrong.
Well, this has been a delight. I want to thank you for making time for us. And I guess my closing question is, what's next for Lori Garver? I know a couple of space nonprofits that could use your expert guidance, but I suspect you have other plans.
I have been focused on the book for quite a bit of time, and my publisher and publicists would like me to do that for a bit longer. I do sit on a couple of boards and for companies that I think are doing great work, as I'm also a advisor to a venture capital firm, Bessemer Venture Partners, and a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, where I get to continue to work with students, as well as my Brooke Owens Fellowship volunteering and so forth. So I have a very full dance card right now, but I don't have a single long-term gig, and I'm not sure I will again, although I do love to point out that the current head of NASA is nearly 20 years older than me, so don't count me out.
Excellent.
That's the appropriate response. That is the appropriate response.
Great.
You're supposed to laugh.
Yes. Yes.
I did. I just want to again send my congratulations on the book, on your work with Brooke Owens Fellowship, with your amazing career and dedication to the spaceflight world and all you've done. And it has been a genuine pleasure for me to speak with you. So I look forward to the next chapter in your life, and we expect great things from the book and wish you every success with it.
Oh, thank you. Very much appreciated.
Well, likewise. And where can we follow you online?
I'm most active on Twitter, Lori_Garver. That is my same address on Instagram. And I have a website, lorigarver.com.
Excellent. And Geoffrey, where can we keep track of you?
I am also a Twitter enthusiast. I'm at Geoff Notkin, GeoffNotkin, Instagram, YouTube, all the things. And my company is Aerolite Meteorites. If any of you have a hankering for a visitation from a real space rock, that's what I do for my day job.
Always good to talk to a guy that throws rocks. And I don't tweet nearly as much as I should, but I can be stalked on Facebook at your convenience. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this very special conversation. You can find Lori's new book called Escaping Gravity at Amazon or a book retailer near you. Buy it, enjoy it, and be sure to leave a review because authors live and die by their reviews. So thanks again, everybody. Don't forget to drop us a line if you wish at twis@twit.tv. That's TWIS@twit.tv. We welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas. And new episodes of this podcast publish every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe. And please tell your friends and leave us reviews, good ones, I hope. You can always head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS, and you can follow the Twit Tech Podcast Network at Twit on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club Twit. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club Twit Discord, a great clubhouse for Twit listeners. And finally, the Twit Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.